Welcome back to Soviet Times Discovered. Today we're exploring one of the most harrowing aspects of Soviet life, how ordinary people survived periods when there was nothing to eat. This is a story of incredible resilience, resourcefulness, and human endurance in the face of catastrophic food shortages that marked multiple periods of Soviet history. Food scarcity wasn't just a temporary problem in the Soviet Union. It was a recurring nightmare that haunted the country from the revolution through the collapse of the system. While the severity varied dramatically across different periods and regions, the specter of hunger was never far from Soviet consciousness. The worst periods, the Civil War famines, the collectivization famine of the early 1930s, the Siege of Leningrad, and the post-war shortages, tested human survival instincts to their absolute limits. The Russian Civil War from 1918 to 1921 brought the first major Soviet-era famine. Cities were cut off from food supplies as transportation networks collapsed and peasants hoarded grain. Urban populations faced starvation. People ate anything remotely digestible. Leather belts and boots were boiled to extract any nutrients. Wallpaper paste was scraped off and eaten for the flour it contained. Grass, tree bark, and sawdust were mixed into bread to extend meager flour supplies. Cats and dogs disappeared from the streets as people ate their pets to survive. During this period, people learned to see potential food sources everywhere. Pigeons and crows became legitimate game. Plants that would normally be considered weeds were gathered and boiled. People scoured fields after harvest, searching for overlooked grains or potatoes. Even potato peels and vegetable scraps that would normally be thrown away became precious. Women spent hours each day searching for anything that could be eaten or traded for food. Children were sent to scavenge, while adults queued for rations that often never materialized. The urban population shrank dramatically as city dwellers fled to the countryside where food was more available. This wasn't a casual move, but a desperate migration of millions trying to survive. Families that had left villages for city jobs just years before returned, hoping relatives would share food. The cities themselves became ghost towns in some areas, with entire apartment buildings abandoned. Those who remained grew vegetables in any available space. Parks, courtyards, even rooftops became improvised gardens. But nothing compared to the horror of the 1932 to 1933 famine, known in Ukraine as the Holodomor. Stalin's forced collectivization of agriculture and the seizure of grain from peasants created a catastrophic famine that killed millions. In Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and parts of southern Russia, entire villages were wiped out. The government requisitioned grain, leaving peasants with nothing. People ate seed grain that was meant for planting, dooming the next harvest. They slaughtered and ate their livestock, eliminating their means of future survival. As the famine deepened, people resorted to increasingly desperate measures. They dug up grain that had been hidden and buried. They made soup from grass, nettles, and leaves. They ground acorns, which are toxic without proper preparation, into a paste. They ate tree bark, first the soft inner layer, then when that was gone, they ground the outer bark into a powder. Reports describe people's mouths and throats torn and bleeding from eating such rough materials, but they had no choice. Households consumed everything. First went the chickens and pigs that families kept. Then any stored food was eaten, no matter how far in the future it was meant to last. Family heirlooms were traded for food. Though, as famine spread, there was less and less to trade for. Gold jewelry, watches, furniture. All were sold or bartered for a few potatoes or a bit of bread. But eventually even that stopped working because everyone was desperate and no one had food to spare. Children suffered terribly. Mothers tried to save their children by giving them what little food existed, often starving themselves in the process. Orphans wandered the countryside in desperate bands, begging, stealing, scavenging. Some children were sent away by parents who hoped they might find food elsewhere, might survive if they weren't another mouth to feed at home. Many never saw their parents again. The psychological trauma of watching children starve marked an entire generation. In the most extreme cases, which Soviet authorities tried desperately to suppress, but which are documented in archives, cannibalism occurred. Starving people consumed the bodies of those who had already died. In a few terrible instances, there were cases of killing for food. These weren't monsters, but ordinary people driven to the very edge of human existence. Soviet authorities punished such cases harshly when discovered, but the fact that they happened at all reveals the absolute depths of the desperation. The government's response was often to deny the famine existed. Foreign journalists who tried to report on it were barred from affected areas or shown carefully staged scenes. Internal passports prevented peasants from fleeing to cities. Grain continued to be exported even as millions starved, because Stalin needed hard currency and refused to admit the disaster his policies had created. This was state-created famine, and the state's primary concern was maintaining its image rather than saving lives. Those who survived the Great Famine did so through a combination of luck, location, and extreme measures. Some areas were less affected and could share, though this was dangerous, as it could be seen as hoarding. Some people had connections to officials who could provide access to food. Some were simply fortunate enough to have hidden reserves that lasted, and some managed to keep their humanity, sharing with neighbors even when they themselves had almost nothing, believing that cooperation offered better survival chances than isolation. The Siege of Leningrad from 1941 to 1944 created another apocalyptic hunger situation. The city was cut off by German forces, and over 900 days, more than 1 million people died, most from starvation. The food situation deteriorated rapidly. Bread rations shrank to 125 grams per day. For civilians, a few small slices mixed with sawdust and other fillers. People boiled leather goods for the collagen. They made jelly from carpenter's glue. They collected wallpaper paste. They ate pets. Then rats and crows. Leningraders became experts at extracting nutrition from anything. They learned which types of wood could be ground into edible powder. They knew which plants growing in parks had any nutritional value, even in winter. They traded family treasures for food, on the black market, where prices were astronomical and constantly rising. A loaf of bread might cost a month's salary, or a diamond ring. People who had food became wealthy overnight, while those with only money or valuables slowly starved. The cold made everything worse. Leningrad's brutal winters meant people needed calories just to generate body heat, but food was unavailable. People burned furniture and books for warmth. They lay in bed under every blanket and coat they owned, moving as little as possible to conserve energy. Many simply fell asleep and never woke up, their bodies having exhausted every reserve. Bodies lay in the streets, too many for authorities to collect. Some remained frozen until spring. Yet even in Leningrad's hell, humanity persisted alongside horror. People shared their meager rations with neighbors. Musicians performed despite weakness. Teachers held classes for children. Scientists at the Vavilov Institute guarded seed collections for future agriculture, protecting them even as they themselves starved, refusing to eat the seeds despite having edible plants all around them. This dedication to preserving the future, while the present collapsed, showed remarkable courage. Water became crucial for survival. Soup made from hot water, and whatever could be added, a few grains, some grass, a bit of salt provided warmth, and the sensation of eating, even with minimal nutrition. People learned that drinking warm water helped manage hunger pangs. They boiled water continuously, when fuel was available, both for warmth and to create the illusion of a meal. The psychological importance of the ritual of eating, even when eating almost nothing, helped maintain sanity. After World War II, the Soviet Union faced severe food shortages again. The war had devastated agriculture, destroyed infrastructure, and killed millions of farmers and workers. The 1946 to 1947 famine killed perhaps 1 million more people, though exact numbers remain disputed. Drought compounded the damage from war. Once again, people resorted to survival strategies learned during earlier famines: foraging, eating substitute foods, migrating in search of food. The dacha and private plot became essential survival tools. The small plots of land that workers were allowed to cultivate privately produced a disproportionate amount of food. Families spent every free moment gardening, growing potatoes, cabbage, carrots, beets, and other vegetables. These plots weren't hobbies, but lifelines. City dwellers would travel to their dachas on weekends to tend gardens, harvest produce, and preserve food for winter. Without these private plots, Soviet food security would have been far worse. Preservation techniques became vital skills. Every household learned to pickle vegetables, make jams, dry mushrooms, and preserve food by any method possible. Late summer and autumn were consumed by preservation work. Women spent days over hot stoves, preparing jars of pickled cucumbers, tomatoes, and cabbage. Mushroom hunting became a serious activity, with families knowing the best forest locations and spending whole days gathering. These preserved foods made the difference between hunger and survival during long winters. Foraging remained important throughout Soviet history. People gathered berries, nuts, mushrooms, and wild plants. Knowledge of edible plants was passed down through generations. Urban residents maintained surprising amounts of traditional knowledge about what could be safely eaten from nature. Spring brought nettles, which could be made into soup. Summer offered berries. Autumn was mushroom season. Even in peacetime, supplementing purchased food with forage food made budgets stretch further and provided variety to monotonous diets. The Soviet practice of buying in bulk, whenever goods appeared, reflected this survival mentality. If sugar appeared in stores, people bought as much as they could afford and store. If flour was available, they stocked up. This wasn't hoarding in a greedy sense, but rational behavior based on bitter experience. You never knew when goods would disappear again, and having reserves could mean the difference between hunger and sufficiency. Apartments filled with stockpiled food when possible, because shortage could strike without warning. Networks of mutual support were crucial. Extended families shared resources, with those in better situations helping those in worse. Rural relatives might send food to urban family members. Urban relatives might send manufactured goods or money to rural family. Friends and neighbors traded what they had for what they needed. These informal networks of mutual aid functioned alongside but separate from the official economy. They were technically illegal in some periods but were tolerated because everyone participated. The workplace became another source of food. Factory workers might have access to cafeterias with subsidized meals. Collective farm workers, despite being poorly paid, had access to produce. Those working in food industries, bakeries, canneries, grocery stores had opportunities to supplement their diet, sometimes through official channels, sometimes through pilferage. Having a job in food distribution or production was highly valued precisely because of these opportunities. Bartering became essential when money couldn't buy food. People traded services, goods, and favors. A skilled craftsman might repair something in exchange for food. Someone with connections might obtain deficit goods for friends who reciprocated with other help. This barter economy existed throughout Soviet history but became more important during shortages. People learned to cultivate networks of useful contacts and to remember who owed them favors. Children were often sent to live with relatives in areas with better food supplies during severe shortages. A child might spend a summer with grandparents in a village where food was more available, or urban children might be sent to pioneer camps where at least basic meals were provided. Families made difficult decisions about whether separating was better than staying together, when staying together meant everyone going hungry. These separations, though traumatic, sometimes saved lives. The black market flourished during food shortages. Speculators bought goods and resold them at enormous markup. While officially illegal and harshly punished, the black market was often the only place to obtain necessary food. People who were normally law-abiding citizens broke laws to feed their families. The moral calculus was simple. Your children's survival was more important than abstract laws. Those caught faced severe penalties, but desperation overrode fear. Regional differences in food availability meant that some areas faced starvation while others had relative plenty. Central Asia might have fruit and vegetables, when Moscow had bread lines. The Baltic republics often had better food supplies than Siberia. People with the means to travel might take trains to other regions to buy food and bring it back, though this was difficult, expensive, and sometimes illegal. The internal passport system and residency restrictions made such movements complicated. Ethnic Germans, Koreans, Chechens, and other deported peoples faced particularly severe food shortages in their places of exile. Sent to remote regions with minimal infrastructure, they had to create farms from nothing, build shelter, and survive in harsh climates with inadequate supplies. Many died in the first winters. Those who survived did so through extraordinary effort, cooperation within their communities, and adaptation to their new environments. They learned local survival techniques from indigenous peoples and shared their own agricultural knowledge. The mentality of hunger shaped Soviet culture profoundly. The obsession with food, the respect for bread, the compulsion to finish every morsel on your plate. These were responses to lived experience of shortage and starvation. Wasting food was seen not just as wrong, but as almost sinful. Elders, who had survived famines, couldn't stand to see food thrown away. This generational trauma was passed down, with people who had never been hungry themselves still exhibiting behaviors learned from parents who had starved. During less severe shortages that characterized much of the Brezhnev era and later, survival strategies were less dramatic but still necessary. Lines and empty shelves meant planned meals often couldn't be made. People learned culinary improvisation, substituting available ingredients for unavailable ones. Cookbooks included notes on substitutions. Housewives developed creativity in making meals from limited ingredients. A piece of meat might flavor soup for a whole family. Potatoes and bread provided bulk when more nutritious foods weren't available. The cultural emphasis on hospitality coexisted with shortage in interesting ways. Russians traditionally offered abundant food to guests, but this hospitality often meant hosts went without. The appearance of plenty at the table might reflect weeks of saving and sacrifice. Guests rarely knew that the generous spread before them represented a significant portion of the family's monthly food allocation. This maintenance of cultural traditions, despite material hardship, was a point of pride. Children growing up in these conditions learned resourcefulness as survival skill. They understood that food wasn't to be wasted. They knew how to make meals from almost nothing. They could forage and preserve. They understood the complex social networks necessary for obtaining food. But they also lost something: a sense of security, a belief that basic needs would always be met. The uncertainty of food supply created anxiety that persisted even in times of relative plenty. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought another food crisis. As the centralized distribution system broke down and prices liberalized, many people found their savings worthless and couldn't afford food. Pensioners survived on subsistence diets. The survival skills learned during Soviet times, gardening, foraging, preserving, bartering, became necessary again. The dakas that had been recreational retreats became subsistence farms once more. People who had never expected to be hungry again found themselves rationing food. Understanding how Soviet people survived when there was nothing to eat reveals incredible human resilience. They adapted, innovated, shared, and endured. They ate things that shouldn't be eaten, worked impossibly hard, and made unimaginable sacrifices. They preserved their humanity in inhuman circumstances, often helping others even when they themselves had almost nothing. The strategies they developed, the gardens, the preservation techniques, the foraging knowledge, the mutual aid networks enabled survival against extraordinary odds. This history explains much about post-Soviet culture and psychology. The emphasis on having food reserves, the inability to throw away food, the pride in being able to set a generous table, the relief at full store shelves all reflect generations that knew real hunger. The scars from these experiences run deep, passed from grandparents who survived the famines to grandchildren who never knew shortage but learned its lessons nonetheless. Thank you for watching Soviet Times Discovered. If you found this video informative, please like and subscribe for more insights into life and survival in the Soviet Union. Leave a comment below, sharing your family's stories or any topics you'd like us to cover in future videos. Until next time, this has been Soviet Times Discovered.